The thing that kept waking me up wasn't even loud. Not really. It was old-fashioned loud, if that makes sense. Thin, mechanical, like a phone ringing in a movie from the 70s. It would go off 3 or 4 times, stop, then start again. And every time it did, the little battery fan I sleep with would click off like somebody had pulled the plug. I was sitting up in bed in this weird damp room at the Pinecrest Motor Lodge, holding the fan in both hands and smacking the side of it like that was somehow going to fix any part of what was happening. The air smelled like mildew and old fryer grease from a diner next door that had clearly been closed for a while. You know that stale oil smell that sticks in the back of your throat, and every few minutes the ice machine outside would rattle like it was trying to cough something up, then produce absolutely nothing. The phone rang again through the wall. And the really stupid part is that I actually checked my own room first. I travel alone for work more than I like to. Not constantly, but enough that I keep a little overnight bag in my trunk with a phone charger, clean socks, makeup wipes, and this tiny white battery fan because I cannot sleep in silence anymore. I spent years in apartments with traffic outside, neighbors upstairs, somebody's dog losing its at 2 in the morning. Real silence makes me more awake, not less, so I always bring the fan. That night I was only at the motel because everything else had gone wrong in a row. My flight had been canceled after hours of delays. The rental car line was a disaster. And by the time I got on the road, it was raining hard enough that the highway looked like it was melting under my headlights. I wasn't trying to end up at some roadside motor lodge off Route 23 in southern Ohio. I was trying to make it to Columbus by midnight, maybe grab a decent hotel and sleep for 6 hours before a morning meeting. Instead, I got stuck driving through heavy rain on unfamiliar roads with my windshield wipers working harder than they had any right to, and every place I called within range either had no vacancy or didn't answer. Pinecrest was the only place with one room left. At least that's what the clerk told me. The place looked half abandoned from the road, cracked asphalt lot, faded aqua paint on the doors. Neon letters above the office sign hanging sideways so it read more like Piecrt than Pinecrest. All the curtains were clipped shut from the inside with clothespins, every single one. That bothered me before I even parked. The clerk's name was Norris Keene. Older guy, probably late 60s, maybe older, with those heavy glasses that make a person's eyes look a little too large. He had a coffee mug on the desk that said "World's Okayest Grandpa," and there was a crossword book open next to the register with one of those golf pencils tucked into it. He took one look at me soaked from the rain and said, "Only room I've got is 9. I asked if there was anything a little cleaner because I could see one room across the lot that looked, honestly, weirdly better than the others. The curtains were open a few inches and the lamp was on. Fresh paint around the frame. Door looked newer. Number 12. He didn't even turn to look. Just said, "Not 12. I remember laughing a little because I thought maybe he'd misunderstood me. I said, "No, I mean that one looks better." He slid the paper registration card toward me and repeated, "Not 12. Then after I signed and he handed me the key, he said, almost like it was an afterthought, "And if anybody knocks after midnight, don't answer unless they say your name first." He said it so matter-of-factly that for a second I thought maybe it was some strange local joke. But he was serious. Not intense exactly, just tired. Like he'd said it before. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking I should have just left right then, trust me, I know. I know how it sounds. But I was exhausted. I'd already white-knuckled it through an hour and a half of rain on roads I didn't know. My phone battery was low because the rental car charger barely worked, and the idea of getting back out there at almost midnight felt worse than sleeping in a gross motel for a few hours. That was the whole calculation. Bad option, worse option. I picked bad. Room 9 smelled damp enough that I left my shoes on for the first 10 minutes. The comforter had that old motel floral pattern that was probably ugly when it was new. The sink faucet squealed when I turned it on. There was one of those plastic-wrapped paper cups by the bathroom mirror that nobody has ever once trusted. I changed into leggings and an old college zip-up with a broken drawstring, set my fan on the nightstand, shoved a chair under the knob more for peace of mind than anything else, and told myself I was being dramatic. Then the phone started ringing next door. It was so specific that I actually froze and listened. Not a phone sound from a television, not a cell phone ringtone, a rotary phone. That sharp metallic ring. It went on long enough that I pictured some dusty beige desk phone sitting on a nightstand in the room next to mine. When it stopped, I got up and looked through the peephole. Nothing outside. Rain dim lot light. The ice machine shuddered and went quiet again. The phone rang a second time. I called the office from my cell because I wasn't about to trust the room phone, if it even worked. Norris answered on the third ring, sounding more annoyed than concerned. I told him I thought there was a landline going off in the room beside me. He went quiet for a second, then said, "No, there isn't." I said, "I mean, there definitely is. It's been ringing off and on for 5 minutes." And he goes, "Those lines were disconnected years ago. Like that settled it." I asked if maybe it was some old alarm or electrical thing. He said, "Probably." Then he told me to lock my deadbolt and hung up. That should have been it. That should have been the part where I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and sat in my car until morning. Instead, I stood there listening to the rain and convincing myself there had to be a simple explanation. Old building, bad wiring, maybe a sound traveling weird through pipes. People do this when they're tired. You keep picking the least alarming answer because the alarming answer is too inconvenient to hold. I got back in bed, turned the fan toward my face, closed my eyes. Around 1 in the morning, I heard voices through the wall, not loud, muffled, but unmistakably two people arguing. A man and a woman, maybe, though I couldn't make out words. Then a scraping noise like somebody dragging a chair or a dresser across the floor. It went on just long enough that I got irritated before I got scared. I remember thinking, seriously, in this place. My fan clicked off. The room went very still. I called the office again. This time, Norris picked up right away, like he'd been waiting on the phone. I told him there were definitely people next door now, arguing, moving furniture, something. He said, "Room 10 has been empty for months." I sat there with the phone against my ear and just stared at the wall. Then I said, "Well, somebody's in there." He didn't answer that directly. He just said, "Stay in your room." Now that made me mad more than anything, because when somebody tells you to stay in a cheap motel room while something weird is happening next door, it doesn't come off reassuring. So I got out of bed and went to the wall anyway. I put my ear against it, right near where the headboard would have been on the other side. The arguing stopped immediately, not faded. Not ended over a few seconds. Stopped. I stayed there another 10, maybe 15 seconds, barely breathing, nothing. Then from right near where my ear was pressed, I heard one small sound. Not even a word. Just what felt like somebody shifting their weight on the other side and touching the wall back. I pulled away so fast I hit the nightstand with my hip and knocked my fan over. My hands were doing that bad fine motor skill thing where they look normal but won't work right. I tried turning the fan back on. Nothing. Then I set it down and it came back by itself. That was my micro little clue, I guess. Every time something started next door, the fan died first. Exactly first. I didn't know what to do with that, so I did what a lot of people do with things they can't explain. I ignored it as hard as I could. I stayed awake after that with all the lights on. Sometime later, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. Not passing by, stopping, then a knock, gentle, almost polite. I didn't say anything. A woman's voice said, "Housekeeping." "There's water leaking downstairs." First of all, downstairs, where the motel had 1 floor. Second, it was the middle of the night. I went to the peephole and saw a woman in what did look like housekeeping clothes. Faded maid uniform, little name tag, dark hair pulled back. She had a cart with her, but not a real housekeeping cart. More like a luggage dolly, with the trash bag hanging off one side. I opened the door maybe 2 inches with the chain still on. "Enough to speak through," she said. "I need to come in and check under the bed." That would have been a no under the best circumstances. What made it worse was that she never looked at my face. Not once. Her eyes stayed fixed just past me, over my shoulder, straight at the bed like she was waiting to see if someone else was sitting on it. I said there was no leak and started closing the door. She put one hand on it, not hard, just enough to stop it for a second, and said, "Are you alone in there?" very calmly, like she already knew the answer. I shut it and slid the extra lock over so hard it scraped paint. Then I called Norris again, and this time he actually came out to the lot. I watched him through the peephole with a flashlight in one hand, and I swear, a revolver in the other. Not tucked away either, just holding it at his side like it belonged there. He checked outside my room, then room 10, then the empty stretch toward 12. No housekeeping woman, no cart, nothing. When he came back to my door, he said, "Get your shoes on." That was all. No explanation. I opened the door because at that point, sitting alone inside felt worse than following an old man with a flashlight and a gun. He walked me toward the office, and as we got halfway there, I heard a man scream from somewhere above us. Not ahead of us, not behind us. Above us, the motel only had one floor. I stopped dead in the walkway. Norris stopped too, and I saw this look on his face that made every dumb explanation I'd been hanging on to just fall apart. He looked embarrassed, which somehow was worse than frightened. Like he had known there were things he hadn't told me because telling them would sound crazy. He said, "Previous owners built service passages for plumbing, wiring, God knows what else. Some of them run overhead between vents." I just stared at him. He added, "They shouldn't be accessible," which is not a comforting sentence. In fact, it may be the least comforting sentence. We went to check the hallway section by room 12, and that was when everything tipped fully into not okay. The door to 12 was standing open maybe 6 inches. Norris stopped so hard I almost walked into him. He said very quietly, "No," then more to himself than to me. I nailed that shut, and that is a sentence I would love to go the rest of my life without hearing again. He shoved me behind him and went up to the door with the flashlight. I could see the frame splintered near the latch. There were nails bent outward along the trim like somebody had pried them one by one from inside. The room beyond looked mostly empty, just a mattress on a frame and torn wallpaper, but I couldn't see the whole thing. Norris backed away and told me to get to the office. Not run, just get there. Which of course made me want to run immediately. We got inside and he locked the front door, then the back office door, then dragged a filing cabinet in front of the little hallway that led to the supply closet. I was standing there uselessly clutching my room key while he moved like someone doing a routine he already knew. I asked him what was happening. He finally said, "I think somebody's been using the old passages again. There are certain words people drop into a sentence by accident that tell you way more than they meant to." We were in the office maybe 2 minutes before we heard something in the wall behind the soda machine. Slow thump. Then another, not pounding. More like somebody testing where the studs were. Norris told me to get behind the counter and handed me his office phone to call 911 while he went into the little back room. I could hear the dispatcher asking me to repeat the address because my voice was shaking so badly. Then from the back room, Norris said, "Miss Morrow, come here." He had pulled aside a warped shelving unit, and behind it part of the drywall had been loosened already, almost like a panel. He jammed the butt of the revolver into the seam and yanked. The drywall peeled back in a chalky sheet. Behind it was a narrow crawl space, maybe 3 feet wide, running between the office and the rooms. Insulation hanging out, vent pipes, electrical lines. And down at the base of it, right there where the flashlight hit, there was a blanket, a pillow, food wrappers, 2 water bottles, a cigarette pack, and pages of notebook paper covered in writing. Fresh smoke drifted out like somebody had just exhaled and moved. Then deeper inside, fast but not panicked, I heard footsteps retreating through the walls. Not running, just moving away because they knew we'd found where they'd been. That was the actual worst moment for me. Not the knocking, not the screaming, not room 12. It was seeing proof that somebody had been close enough to hear me sleeping, hear me on the phone, probably watch through vents or cracks whenever they wanted. And they hadn't been there for one night. They'd been living there, comfortable enough to leave bedding and notes. Norris fired one warning shot through a vent at the top of the space. The sound inside that office was unbelievable. My ears rang for minutes. Plaster dust came down from the ceiling. Somewhere out in the hallway, something metal clanged over. Then everything went dead quiet, except for the ice machine outside doing its stupid empty rattle. We barricaded ourselves in the office after that. Norris shoved the shelving unit partly back in place and sat in a chair facing the hallway with the revolver across his lap. I crouched behind the desk with the dispatcher still on speaker. Every now and then we heard movement travel through the walls. A scrape here, a soft bump there. Once unmistakably, right above us, the deputies didn't get there until dawn. That's not a criticism. We were in the middle of nowhere, and it was storming half the night. But if you've never waited for daylight while listening to something move inside the walls of a building, I don't recommend it. Time got weird. Every minute was either 5 seconds or an hour. At one point, Norris asked me if I'd answered the door earlier. I said no. He just nodded and said, "Good," that's all he said about it. When the deputies arrived, they cleared the property room by room, then brought in more people once they found the passages. They found food wrappers, bedding, cigarette butts, a flashlight, old tools, and pages of notes, room numbers, descriptions, times guests came in, what kind of car they drove, whether they were alone. My room number was in there, so was 12. They never found the person, at least not while I was there. I gave my statement after sunrise, sitting on a plastic chair in the office while everything smelled like wet dust and old coffee. One deputy asked if I wanted an ambulance, because apparently I looked bad enough for that question to come up. I said no, I just wanted to leave. I drove out once the roads were light enough to see, and I didn't stop again until I hit a busy Gullah's gas station with one of those giant travel centers attached. I went inside, bought the worst coffee I've ever had, and stood near the hot dog rollers for 10 solid minutes because I didn't want to be alone in my car. Police never identified whoever had been in those walls. That's the part that still gets me. They had fresh bedding, recent food, detailed notes on guests by room number. Enough to suggest they'd been there for weeks, maybe longer, and still nothing. No name, no arrest, no real answer. Now when I travel, I look up hotel floor plans online if I can. I check satellite views. I read the weird one-star reviews, not the nice ones. And I don't sleep well in rooms that share interior walls with strangers. I can do hallways, I can do elevators, I can do the normal hotel noises, but that shared wall thing is done for me. Also, I still sleep with the fan, which feels a little insulting, honestly. What I never got an answer for was who that woman at my door actually was, because if somebody had been living in those walls long enough to take notes on guests, they knew exactly which room to knock on. Story break. The next one comes from somebody who was being paid to keep a place like this running. Story 2. The first thing I noticed was that the vacancy sign never changed, even when there were clearly people staying there. I don't mean maybe people. I mean air conditioners dripping into buckets, grocery bags showing up outside doors, cigarette smoke on the walkways after dark, that kind of thing. The sign just stayed on vacancy all day and all night like it wasn't attached to the same property. This was outside Doña Ana County, off Interstate 10, at a place called Desert Palm Courts. Real sun-cooked, beat-down, should have been condemned kind of motel, boarded pool in the middle. Concrete walkways bleached almost white. Swamp coolers older than me humming at different speeds all night. The whole place smelled like chlorine, dust, and overheated wiring, which is not a combination anybody should get used to. But after a couple weeks I did. I'm Everett. I do maintenance work, mostly plumbing, some electrical, enough drywall to lie and say I know drywall, or I did. This was a few years after I lost my union position. Long story short, some layoffs, some pride, some bad timing. I took cash jobs because cash jobs took me. That's the honest version. I have a tackle box in my garage filled with motel keycards from old contracts, not because I'm sentimental, just because I empty my pockets into the nearest container. And that happened to become the container. Red box, 2 trays, hooks on one side from when it actually held fishing stuff. If you dumped it out right now, you'd probably find keycards from Tucson, Las Cruces, Amarillo, 3 places in West Texas, and this one if I'd ever been given a card there. Desert Palm still used brass keys with plastic tags big enough to hit somebody with. The owner was a woman named Maribel Tate. Mid-50s, always in nice shoes that made no sense for the place, always smelling faintly like expensive lotion over bleach. She paid cash every Friday in a plain envelope, and had one rule she mentioned before she explained the plumbing issue. 3 rooms are occupied full-time. No housekeeping, no maintenance, no entry. I said, all right, long-term tenants. She said exactly, like we were agreeing on something. My work order was cheap repairs. That was the level of professionalism. Not full renovation, not proper replacement. Just keep it going. Patch the pipe under 12. Replace 2 fixtures in the back laundry. Get lukewarm water down to something closer to hot in the south wing. That kind of work. Enough to keep rooms rentable, enough to postpone the kind of inspection that ends things. The first odd thing beyond the sign was the locks. A lot of motel rooms have extra security added over time, but usually from the inside. These had extra locks installed from the outside on several doors, not every room, just some. Slide bolts, hasps. One door had marks where a padlock had been used recently. Maribel told me that was from an old security problem after a break-in. I accepted that because I accepted a lot in those days. That's the part I'd like to dress up a little for my own comfort, but there isn't much point now. I was there on assignment, if you want to call it that, for almost 3 weeks. During the day, it looked half dead. A couple parked pickups, one vending machine that only sold orange soda and peanut M&Ms, no visible guests. But at night, you'd hear things. Arguments through walls in languages I couldn't place. Not Spanish, at least not any Spanish I knew. Short bursts of talking, then silence the second you pass talk close. Doors shutting very gently. Swamp coolers rattling. Somebody coughing behind a wall they weren't supposed to be behind. There were 3 rooms Maribel had warned me off, but pretty soon I realized it was more than 3 that behaved like occupied rooms with no occupants. Curtains stayed closed all day. Lights bled around painted-over window edges at night. Trash levels changed even when nobody came out carrying trash. One evening, a grocery delivery car pulled up. Not a formal service, just some guy in an old sedan with plastic bags in the back seat. He carried 2 loads to a room with the windows painted black from the inside, not covered with curtains. Painted. He knocked in a pattern. The door opened 3 inches. The bags went in. Door shut. I never saw who took them. When I asked Maribel, she said, night shift workers. They sleep all day. That doesn't explain painted windows, but there you go. If you've worked enough repair jobs, you know there are places where you're not supposed to ask questions because asking questions is how you lose the check. I knew that. I also knew I was behind on rent at home. My truck needed front brakes, and pride doesn't buy groceries. So every time something didn't add up, I reached for the explanation that let me keep working. Privacy, night shifts, family situation, people hiding from an ex, people down on their luck, people who didn't want cops sniffing around. All of those things are real. That's what made it easy. The first time I understood it might be worse was when I went to change a broken shower cartridge and found a stack of confiscated IDs in the office drawer. Not a giant stack, 7 or 8. Different states, some out of date, some current. Maribel caught me looking and said they were being held for safekeeping because some workers lost things if they kept them. Workers. That word landed different. Not guests, not tenants. Workers. I didn't push it. I wish I had. I didn't. A few nights later, I was closing up my tools and passed one of the restricted rooms. I noticed scratches around the exterior lock plate. Not just on that one, on all of them. Same kind of scratches, same height. Different paint layers underneath. Different ages to the doors, but the marks were identical. Like people had done the same desperate little tugging motion from the inside over and over for years. That detail stayed with me. Still does. You don't accidentally make the same mark on multiple doors across multiple paint jobs unless the same thing keeps happening. Part of what made the whole place feel wrong was how it cycled. There'd be a day where I convinced myself I was being dramatic. Then a night where I'd hear muffled arguing in some language I couldn't pin down and feel that little drop in my stomach again. Then morning would come and nothing visible would support it. Empty walkway, heat already rising off the concrete. Maribel at the office window acting like we ran a normal low-budget motel and not something rotting in plain sight. Then came the part that belonged squarely on me. County inspectors showed up after some complaint about wiring. 2 trucks, clipboards, reflective vests, not playing around. Maribel saw us pull in and got this very still look. She took me behind the laundry room and said I needed to disconnect the hallway smoke alarms temporarily because the system kept false triggering. And if inspectors started poking into the restricted rooms, they'd make a whole scene over old wiring. I said that sounded like exactly what inspectors were for. She said these people don't want officials in their lives. That was her angle. Not safety, privacy, fear of exposure. and I let her use it because I was ready to be convinced. I told myself the residents were choosing to stay. I told myself maybe they were undocumented and maybe an inspection would bring immigration problems and maybe keeping my head down was kinder than blowing something up I didn't fully understand. Also, and this is the ugliest part, I wanted my Friday envelope. Both things were true. Maybe the second one was truer, so I disconnected the hallway smoke alarms. Anybody who wants to judge that can go ahead. I do. After that, I couldn't really pretend anymore. I saw a crew come through one afternoon, not a repair crew, more like labor brokers. 2 men, 1 woman, van with no business name on it. They went room to room collecting papers. Not all the rooms, just the quiet ones. One guy came out holding a handful of documents with rubber bands around them. Maribel saw me seeing it and just said, "Payroll stuff, sure." That same week, I went into the office for change for the vending machine and found a folder open on the desk, handwritten lists, names, dollar amounts, transportation, housing, protection, food advance, work boots, phone use. Every line had money attached to it. Some of the names had been crossed out so hard the paper tore. No date, no note, nothing to say if crossed out meant paid, transferred, left, or worse. I didn't confront her then either. I closed the folder and walked back out like a coward in work boots. That night, the swamp coolers were all over the place, one high, one low, one making a noise like a dying lawnmower. You get used to building noises when you do maintenance. Your brain starts sorting them without asking you. Normal hum, bad fan belt, pipe knock, loose cover plate. So when I smelled hot insulation behind one sealed room door, I knew before I touched it that something was cooking inside the wall. I knocked, no answer. I knocked harder and yelled that they needed to open up. I heard movement, then coughing. And that's the problem with systems like that. Once you've spent enough time pretending not to see them, the emergency doesn't arrive as some clean outside event. It arrives through the thing you helped keep running. I shouted for Maribel. She came jogging up the walkway in those impossible shoes and tried the outer lock first, which tells you everything about who controlled those rooms. The key jammed. Smoke started threading out around the door frame. Not heavy, just enough. I asked where the alarm pole was and remembered I had disconnected the system. That's a bad thing to remember at exactly that moment. We forced the door with a pry bar from my truck. Inside was a hot plate set up against the far wall and wiring so bad it looked handmade. The fire was still small, mostly in the paneling behind an outlet, but the room was filling fast. 2 men and a woman came out coughing, grabbing blankets, and 1 plastic grocery bag like that was all they owned. One of them kept saying no police, over and over. Then it spread in a direction I hadn't expected, into the wall cavity up past the old cooler line. Not a movie fire, nothing exploding. Just fast enough to turn a manageable problem into something wider, and people started running. Not toward the road, not toward the office, out the back, into the dark desert behind the motel. Several from rooms I didn't know were occupied at all. Thin figures coming from shadows, carrying almost nothing. I yelled that emergency crews were on the way. One guy looked back at me like I was the one not understanding something simple, kept going. They feared deportation more than the fire. That was the plain fact of it. Whatever story Maribel had built around protection and housing and work, it had trained people to run from the very help they needed. Emergency crews got there, then sheriff's deputies, then inspectors came back with a whole different energy. Once the door got kicked open on what was actually happening, it went fast. Too fast in a way. Fast enough to look like action, not fast enough to fix anything. I cooperated. I gave statements. I showed them the folder with the handwritten debts and the crossed-out names. I told them about the IDs. I told them Maribel had me disconnect the hallway smoke alarms. I didn't leave that out, though, believe me, there was a version of myself that wanted to. I quit that day. Didn't even wait for the last envelope. But quitting isn't much of a clean ending when the damage was already done. A bunch of residents had scattered into the desert, and by the time crews and investigators had control of the scene, no one knew where several of them had gone. Maybe to another motel. Maybe to some work site farther west. Maybe back to the same people through a different door. That's what eats at me. After investigators started going through the office for real, they found more records than the first folder. Transportation debts, rent debts, charges for blankets, charges for rides, charges for protection. Enough debt on paper that nobody could ever realistically leave, even if the door had been standing open. A closed system. You work, you owe. You stay, you owe more. A few names were crossed out in those ledgers, and nobody would tell me if they ever figured out why. I don't take cash-only contracts anymore. I don't care how bad a month looks. If somebody wants to hand me an envelope and keep things off paper, I hear those hallway coolers humming, and I remember exactly how much a person can talk himself past when he wants a check. That's not me trying to sound noble now. It's me knowing I'm not trustworthy around certain kinds of desperation, especially my own. And if you've ever driven Interstate 10 and passed one of those motels with half the rooms dark, and half the room somehow occupied anyway, with a vacancy sign on when it shouldn't be, I need you to understand I do not think Desert Palm was unusual. I think it was one tile in a long row. Story break. This third account isn't violent in the usual way, which honestly might be why it stuck with me. Story 3, by the time I noticed the clocks, I had already decided the place was just old. Not creepy old, not movie old, just neglected. The kind of roadside motel that survives by accident for 20 extra years, because the highway used to matter more than it does now. Lantern View Motel sat off Highway 89 outside Kane County, up on a rise where you could look out over dry red rock and scrub and think, for about 30 seconds, that you had found a charming little detour. Then you got close enough to smell old carpet cleaner and hot dust in those creosote bushes outside after a day of heat, and the charm loosened up pretty fast. I was there by choice. That's important. Nobody sent me. Nobody forced me off the road. I had retired recently and was taking solo photography trips because I like driving, and I like not explaining my schedule to anybody. I keep handwritten mileage logs for every road trip I take, even little ones. Always have. Date, odometer, route, stops, gas price if I'm in the mood to be thorough. My children make fun of it, which is fair. I had the notebook on the passenger seat the whole trip, clipped open with a blue pen stuck through the spiral. A rock slide had closed the main route earlier than I expected, and traffic was being pushed onto a detour that added hours. I decided I would rather stop before dark than drive unfamiliar canyon roads half asleep. That was the entire thought process. Sensible, I still think. Lantern View had a broken vacancy sign out front that buzzed constantly even though half the bulbs were missing. Not flickering. Buzzing like an electric insect that had no intention of dying. The office calendar behind the check-in counter still said August, which I noticed because it was November and because I noticed calendars. The owner, Lucien Firth, was elderly, neat in an old-fashioned way, with a pressed shirt and little silver sleeve garters that made him look like he'd stepped out of some earlier decade and wasn't interested in catching up. He looked at my driver's license, looked at me, and said, "Room 4. The plumbing behaves better there, not works better. Behaves better." I remember smiling politely because I thought maybe he was making a dry joke, and I didn't want to be rude if he was. My room had one of those heavy bedspreads with a pattern of brown leaves, a dresser that leaned slightly to the left, and a wall clock above the television that was 7 minutes ahead of the office clock. The bathroom clock, a little travel one plugged in by the sink, was 4 minutes behind. I noticed because I always notice clocks when I'm traveling. It has to do with timing photographs and medicine and, apparently, having enough of a control streak to inventory a room by the minute. There were clocks everywhere on the property. Office, lobby, hallway, room. None of them matched. That was the first wrong note, I guess, though at the time I didn't treat it like one. Old people forget to set clocks. Old motels acquire odd habits. I wrote my mileage down at the desk, took 2 aspirin because the drive had tightened my shoulders, and went back outside with my camera to catch the last light on the canyon. I packed like I always pack. Small black rolling suitcase with the sticky handle button. Denim overshirt because desert nights lie to you all day about how cold they're going to get. Granola bars in the side pocket because I never trust roadside vending machines. There was nothing dramatic about any of it. At dusk, I saw a young couple near the ice machine. They were maybe mid-20s, hard to tell in the fading light, both wearing light denim jackets like they'd coordinated without fully meaning to. The woman had a red scarf. The man had one hand in his pocket. As I walked past, I heard her say, "No, if we leave now, we'll miss it." Not speaking to me, just continuing a conversation. Later, maybe 20 minutes later, I saw them again near the office. Same clothes, obviously. Same positions, almost. And I heard the woman say, "No, if we leave now, we'll miss it." Exact same tone. Now, anyone who's done long solo drives knows your brain can play tricks when you're tired. You repeat things to yourself. You half hear something and file it wrong. I told myself I'd simply caught the same sentence at two different moments in a longer conversation. Not impossible. Still, I noticed the vacancy sign buzzing had stopped while they were standing there. The second they moved out of view, it started again. That happened 3 times over the evening. I'd hear the sign, then silence, then see them nearby. I did not know what to do with that either, so I filed it under coincidence and went to eat the peanut butter crackers I'd brought with me because the nearest diner looked closed and I wasn't in the mood to drive back out. Later that night, I passed them a third time by the vending machines. Same denim, same scarf, same little pause between words. And again I heard, "No, if we leave now, we'll miss it." At that point, I did what everybody always says they do immediately. I tried to test myself. I went back to my room, checked the time on all 3 clocks I could see, wrote them down in the mileage notebook margin, then sat quietly on the bed and listened. The sign buzzed, the pipes clicked. Somewhere far off, a truck changed gears on the highway. After a while, I felt embarrassed with myself. It was beginning to seem like I was trying to manufacture a story out of an ordinary evening, and at my age, that is a humiliating feeling. You start thinking, is this how it starts? Is this how a person becomes unreliable to herself? So I took a shower. When I came out, the towel I'd left bunched on the vanity had been folded in thirds, exactly in thirds. My suitcase handle, which I always leave facing the door because I trip over it otherwise, had been turned toward the wall. My mileage notebook had moved from the dresser to the table by the window. Not far, an inch, maybe 2, but enough that I knew it hadn't been where I left it. I went straight to the office. Lucien was behind the counter reading a paperback with the cover bent backward. I asked if anyone had entered room 4 while I was out. He said no before I'd even finished the sentence. I mentioned the couple, just casually at first, the young pair in denim jackets. He looked up too fast, that was the first thing. Then he smiled, but the smile didn't settle right. "I don't know how else to put it," he said. "Travelers cross paths. That's what motels are." Not an answer. I asked if there were many other guests. He said, "Not many now." Again, not an answer. By then it was full dark. The sign kept buzzing. The clocks kept disagreeing with one another. I went back to my room and tried to read. But every time I looked up, some object felt slightly wrong in its placement. The lamp angle, the suitcase wheels, the notebook. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make me doubt the sequence of my own actions. Around 10 or so, maybe a little later, I saw the young couple again through my window walking past room 4. Same pace, same clothes. And the woman said, clear as day, "No, if we leave now, we'll miss it." My skin didn't crawl or anything theatrical like that. I just got tired all at once. Tired in a deep, sick way, like my body had decided before my mind did that something was off. I put on my shoes and carried my notebook to the office under the excuse of getting ice. Though the ice machine was obviously decorative at best, the lobby was unattended. Lucien had stepped somewhere out back, I assumed. On the desk was an open guest ledger, one of those old bound books with lined pages and carbon paper tucked in. I probably should have left it alone. Instead, I looked. The first thing I noticed was repetition. Names recurring across years, not common names either, but uncommon combinations. A Margaret with the same elaborate last name flourish, checking in 6 years apart, in apparently identical handwriting. A family name repeated 3 summers in a row with the same slant to the letters, same pressure, same oversized capital R. I turned back farther. More repetitions. Decades of them, if the dates were to be believed. One page listed guests who had supposedly checked out long before the highway bypass, before the place looked as worn down as it did now. Another page had ink so faded it was nearly brown, but the signature style matched one from just a few years earlier almost exactly. I started taking photographs with my phone, quietly, quickly. Not because I had a theory, just because something in me said that if I didn't preserve what I was looking at, I'd later convince myself I'd misunderstood it. Then I saw an indentation on an older page. You know how if someone writes hard enough on one sheet, it presses into the page below. It wasn't ink, just pressure marks. I tilted the ledger toward the lamp, and there, faint but unmistakable, was my own last name pressed into the paper several entries above where I had signed in for room 4. Not fully legible at first, just the shape of it. Then I angled it again, and there it was. Vukic, my handwriting, my V, the little hitch in the K that I've always had. On an older page, before the line where Lucien had watched me sign in, I heard the sign outside stop buzzing. And when I looked up, the young couple were in the lobby doorway, not entering. Just there, same clothes, same posture, same expressionless waiting almost. The woman looked at me and said, "No, if we leave now we'll miss it." No one smiled, no one moved. Lucien came in through the side door right then, saw all 3 of us. And for the first time since I'd arrived, he looked openly frightened. Not angry that I was at the ledger, frightened. He said, "You should go back to your room," I said. "Who are they?" He didn't answer. He just repeated, "You should go back to your room." I went, because by then I did not trust my own ability to measure the situation. That's the part I still replay. I wasn't thinking, "This is haunted," or any nonsense like that. I was thinking maybe I've had some sort of episode. Maybe I'm too tired. Maybe there's an explanation within reach. And if I say it out loud, I'll sound unstable in a motel lobby in the middle of nowhere. So I retreated. That's the truth. Back in room 4, I locked the door and looked through the photographs I'd taken. Most were clear enough. The ledger pages, the dates, the names. One photo, taken earlier in the lobby without my realizing it, included a framed picture hanging behind the desk. I zoomed in because something about it bothered me. It was labeled 1987 on the frame. Standing in front of the motel in that photograph were a handful of people, Lucien much younger among them, and off to one side, the same young couple I had seen all evening. Same denim jackets. Same red scarf, same hand in his pocket, same positions, same expressions, as if the picture and the people outside my room had been made from the same moment, and one of them had never moved on. That was when I stopped trying to solve it and started trying to leave it. I packed before dawn without turning on the television or opening the curtains. I put the mileage notebook in my purse instead of the suitcase because I wanted it on my person. I didn't shower, didn't brush my teeth there, didn't use the coffee maker. Little refusals like that suddenly mattered to me. I left the room key on the dresser and walked to my car while the sign was still buzzing in the dark. The office wasn't open yet, which was exactly what I wanted. No confrontation, no final questions, no chance for Lucien to tell me I had misunderstood him or to ask what I thought I'd seen. I loaded the suitcase, got in, and drove out without looking back until I reached the highway. Then, of course, I looked back. From the road, the motel seemed smaller. Just another old property sitting under too much sky, perfectly capable of being ordinary from a distance. Later, after I got home, I started checking records because that's what I do when something won't sit right. County, listings, archived maps, road changes, business registrations. As far as official records showed, Lantern View Motel had closed after the bypass nearly 12 years earlier. Not recently. Not limping along. Closed. That doesn't prove anything by itself. Records are wrong all the time. People keep businesses going under old names. Rural places slip through cracks. But the photographs were real. The ledger copies were real. I had them photocopied and folded into the back of my mileage notebook, and they are still there. I stopped taking solo road trips after sunset after that, not because I think every old motel is some kind of trap, but because I learned I can no longer trust my appetite for explanations once the details start slipping out of place. And I never warned anyone, which is probably my least flattering piece in all this. I left quietly because some part of me was afraid that if I described the clocks and the repeated sentence and the photograph from 1987, I would sound like an unstable older woman inventing a story around a bad night's sleep. Maybe that's all I was. But I still can't explain why my signature was already pressed into the ledger before I ever signed the page. Story break. The last story is the one that feels the most fixable, which I think is why it bothers me. Story 4. I heard my own name before I saw anyone. Just a whisper from the upper walkway somewhere above me. Not loud enough to be a shout, not soft enough to be the wind. Blair! I stopped in the courtyard of the Harbor Inn with my camera hanging against my chest and a stick of peppermint gum half unwrapped in one hand. And I did that thing where you look up first and only then realize your body had already stopped moving a second earlier. Rusted balcony rails on the second floor were vibrating from trucks hitting the route out front. Mold and bleach and trapped salt water were all baked together in the air. Somewhere nearby, a television was playing low through a wall in a building that was supposed to have no power. I remember thinking, okay, homeless squatters. Fine, not fine. Exactly, but explainable. What I did not think was that the property manager standing 20 feet behind me had used my first name only once, back in the office, and not in a way anyone upstairs should have heard. I'm Blair. At the time, I was doing freelance insurance photography, which sounds fancier than it is. Mostly, I documented properties after storm damage, so adjusters and law firms and whoever else could argue over files later without leaving their air conditioning. Hotels, strip malls, apartment stairwells, private homes if the owner signed off. I was good at it because I noticed details and because I don't mind ugly places. I also carried peppermint gum constantly, 'cause stale indoor smells trigger migraines for me, and gum was cheaper than losing work. Harbor Inn Motor Court outside Mobile County had taken flood damage during a hurricane season that seemed to go on forever. The file said condemned pending demolition permits. Two-story roadside motel beside an abandoned seafood buffet and a trucking route. I was told the place should be empty and needed full overnight documentation because demolition crews were supposedly starting the next day, and the insurer wanted everything shot before first light. That should have been my first problem, honestly. Overnight alone, condemned building, rush timeline. But I was young and trying to prove I could handle the jobs that older photographers turned down. When you're starting out, competence gets tangled up with stubbornness in a really unhelpful way. The property manager, Curtis Vale, met me in the office wearing a polo shirt with some old management company logo on it, and carrying a flashlight that was brighter than mine by a ridiculous margin. He talked fast like he was trying to keep me in motion. Said the building had no active utilities, no legal occupants, and no reason for delay. Finish before sunrise, hand off memory cards later, easy check. The lobby smelled like bleach poured over rot. Fresh coffee grounds were in the trash can behind the counter, not old grounds either. Damp. Recent. I noticed because I noticed trash in vacant buildings. It tells on people. Curtis saw me looking and said he stopped in early. At midnight. Sure, I started on the exterior. Standard approach, wide shots, elevation angles, floodline markings, balcony corrosion, stairwell damage, foundation cracks if visible. Every time a truck rolled by on the route, the balcony rails buzzed in my frame. Not enough to collapse, probably. Enough to make me hurry. Several room numbers had been removed entirely from doors. Not fallen off, removed. You could see cleaner patches of paint where the digits had been, different shapes underneath. One door had clearly been a 6 once. Another maybe an 8. Another could have been 13 or 15, hard to tell. But the paint behind each missing number was cleaner than the rest of the door. Like somebody had been managing identities, not just neglecting maintenance. I photographed that too. From inside one supposedly vacant room, I heard a television playing softly, not static. Not some broken electrical whine, a real program, muffled voices and canned laughter. I mentioned it to Curtis over my shoulder while I logged the room. He said, "Squatters drift in sometimes, probably a battery unit." He said it too quickly and without looking. That set the tone for the next couple hours. Every clear sign of occupancy got trimmed down into something temporary or unserious by him. Movement behind a curtain on the far wing. Probably loose fabric, fresh cigarette ash in a stairwell, probably from earlier workers. A bathroom mirror still warm from humidity, probably trapped moisture. If you've done field work with somebody who is minimizing in real time, you know how contagious it can be. Their calm becomes a challenge. You start thinking maybe you're the inexperienced one. Maybe you're reading too much into ordinary contamination in a damaged site. Then somebody whispered my name from the second floor. I looked up and saw nothing but black rectangles where windows should have been, and the rail shaking from another passing truck. Curtis asked what I was doing. I said I thought I heard something. He shrugged and kept unlocking rooms. The interiors were exactly what you'd expect at first. Flood-marked drywall, stripped mattresses, weird tide residue under dressers, warped baseboards, mold blooming behind flaked paint. I shot everything: hallways, bathroom tiles, detached ceiling panels, a dead palmetto bug curled in a sink. Boring misery. Then I went back to the lobby for a lens cloth and saw fresh coffee grounds in the trash again. More than before. Like somebody had emptied a new filter. I asked Curtis if someone else was on property. He said no. I said, then who's drinking coffee? He just smiled in this patient, condescending way and said, "You'd be surprised how long a building can look recently used after a storm. That isn't how coffee works. Anybody with a kitchen knows that." Still, I kept going. Professional pride is not a noble thing in moments like this. It just makes you walk deeper into buildings, because you don't want to be the person who tapped out over vibes. Around 2 in the morning, I caught movement behind a curtain on the upper level. Clear movement. Somebody stepping back after looking out. I said so. Curtis finally sighed and gave me what sounded like the truth. He said a few unhoused people occasionally sheltered there between patrols, and if that's what was making me nervous, he'd walk the remaining rooms with me. Show me the maintenance areas. Prove there was nothing organized happening. And to be fair, that did help for a minute. That's the false relief part, if I'm telling this cleanly. Once he acknowledged some level of occupancy, my brain relaxed because at least the signs matched a story. Not ideal, but coherent. He even took me through 2 maintenance closets and a stripped laundry room and showed me broken panels, disconnected lines, empty storage spaces. He acted slightly embarrassed, like he'd been trying to avoid liability, language, and had overdone it, so I bought it enough to continue. While we were walking that upper balcony, I kept noticing the patches where room numbers had been removed. Cleaner paint shaped like different digits. It started feeling deliberate in a way I couldn't articulate yet. Not random vandalism, not lost hardware, administrative, like the building map had been edited after the fact. We split up briefly on the second floor, so I could shoot a corner room, and he could supposedly grab paperwork from the office. I remember that because I specifically told him I'd be 5 minutes, and he said, "Take your time." Inside the room, most of it was stripped. Mattress frame, broken lamp, water line on the wall. I shot wide, then detail, then turned to photograph the closet and noticed a service door slightly ajar at the back. Not a guest door, utility access. Behind it was a narrow room with a pegboard. On the pegboard hung motel keys, dozens of them. Old metal keys with plastic tags labeled by room number, including numbers that did not exist anywhere on the current building map. Several had paper slips rubber banded to them with handwritten notes. Checkout dates, recent ones. That same week recent. One said cash paid, one said late arrival, one said no ID, no ID. My stomach did that quick, cold little flip where your body identifies the story a half second before your thoughts can format it. I took photographs, fast, no flash. Then I noticed a ledger book on the shelf below the keys. Not official software printouts, obviously. Handwritten occupancy records, names or partial names, sometimes just initials. Room numbers that had been removed from doors. Cash amounts. Short stays. Notes about avoiding front office cameras. Which was funny because there were no working front office cameras. Curtis was renting condemned rooms off the books. Maybe not alone. Maybe for a company. Maybe for himself. But not as casual shelter, as business. I stepped back into the stripped room and heard him in the hallway before I saw him. "You find something?" Neutral tone. Too neutral. I said just wiring access. Then I made a decision that was both smart and too late. I pulled one memory card from the camera and slipped it into the coin pocket of my jeans while keeping the second card in the camera body. Redundancy. I should have done that an hour earlier. Instead of leaving immediately, I opened one more door. This is my moral failing in the story, not some huge sin. Just the stupid, professional, ego-driven need to confirm what I already knew before I acted on it. I wanted proof good enough that nobody could talk around it later. I wanted the shot. The door was to one of the removed number rooms at the far end of the balcony. Curtis had never unlocked it in front of me. The key from the pegboard fit. Inside was a fully furnished room. Not nice, not clean, but lived in. Lamps with bulbs, a made bed, plastic bags of groceries, prescription bottles on the dresser, a child's backpack on the floor, crayons. And taped to the wall beside the television, 3 children's drawings on printer paper, all soft stick figure houses and blue sky, and one badly drawn dog in a condemned motel. In a room that did not officially exist. Someone had been living there that same night. Maybe more than one person. A mug in the sink still had wet coffee grounds clinging inside. I took 2 photos before I heard Curtis behind me. "What are you doing in there?" Not a question. More like a line in a play he was tired of repeating. I turned and he was blocking most of the doorway. Not close enough to touch me, but close enough that the room suddenly felt much smaller. I told him I had photographed undocumented occupancy in a legally uninhabitable structure and was leaving with the file. I said it in my work voice, the one I used when arguing with contractors who thought a young freelancer could be bullied off a shot list. He said, "You mean the car?" I laughed a little, because sometimes when you're genuinely alarmed your body picks a weird lane. I said no. He stepped in and put a hand out, palm up, like I was inconveniencing him by making him ask twice. What I remember most is not fear exactly. It was how fast trust evaporated. Every explanation he'd given me reorganized in my head all at once. The televisions, the coffee, my name from upstairs, the missing room numbers, the hurry to finish before sunrise. He didn't need documentation completed before demolition. He needed documentation completed without me noticing the people still inside the building. I moved for the door and he moved too. Then it got physical in a clumsy, ugly, unimpressive way, not movie fighting. Grabbing wrists, shoulder into doorframe, camera strap tangling under my arm, me shoving hard with both hands because I needed him off the threshold. He caught the camera and yanked. I let the strap go and drove forward under his arm. He grabbed at my jacket pocket, probably thinking the card was there. It wasn't. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. One of my shoes half slipped on the damp walkway. The balcony rail rattled from a passing truck, and for one stupid second I thought, if he pushes me here, this is such a pathetic place to die. I start yelling then, not articulate yelling, just loud. That saved me more than anything smart I did. The truck stop next door was still active, and a couple truckers on their break looked up toward the noise. One of them shouted something I didn't catch. Curtis tried to drop the whole thing instantly, like he could transform back into a property manager having a misunderstanding with a contractor. He reached for the camera again, and I swung it into his chest with both hands, which bought me enough space to get to the stairwell. He blocked the top of it for half a second, then thought better of it when he realized we had witnesses. I got past him, down the stairs, across the lot, and straight into the truck stop under those horrible bright lights that never looked so good in my life. People called police. Not just me. That mattered. When officers went through the motel later, they found hidden occupancy records, off-book rentals, and people in rooms the official property files listed as uninhabitable or non-existent. Vulnerable travelers, some avoiding ID checks, some probably avoiding other things too. Not ghosts, not squatters drifting in. A business model built out of places nobody wanted inspected closely. I handed over everything. The visible card, the spare card from my jeans, the site notes. My client was less thrilled about the circumstances than you might think, which told me plenty all by itself. There were legal questions after that about who knew what and when and whether. Keeping condemned motels partially occupied helped delay certain inspections or complicated responsibility. I was not at the center of that part, thank God. I was just the person who tripped over it with a camera. I don't take overnight assignments alone anymore. That's the cleanest change. If a site needs dark hour documentation, there needs to be another crew member, full stop. I don't care if that makes me difficult. I also still keep one photograph from Harbor Inn. Though I probably shouldn't. It's blurred, just a hallway shot I didn't realize I'd taken while moving fast. You can see the mold-stained wall, one missing room number, a slice of balcony rail through the far window. And behind me, barely there in the reflective picture glass at the end of the hall, is the shape of somebody holding a camera at shoulder height. I was the only photographer on site, and I still don't know if Curtis was renting those rooms just for money, or if somebody higher up needed desperate people to stay in condemned motels long enough for the right paperwork not to move.